Hello, everybody. Good evening to you all. I, Jyoti Kapoor, SAS Women of Nagpur, welcome you all to another session of the Right Circle, an initiative of Prabha Khetan Foundation presented by Sri Cement Limited. Established by Dr. Prabha Khetan Foundation provides platforms to caregivers, committed individuals, and like minded institutions to implement cultural, educational, literary, and social welfare projects in India. The pandemic has not been able to deter the foundation's noble cause. Prabha Ketan Foundation has shifted gears using the virtual world to continue with the various sessions to keep up the spirits of its patterns. The Right Circle strives to bring together authors and their readers in an informal and engaging setting. The sessions are structured around the life and works of the author, followed by an interaction with the audience. The Right Circle started its journey from Jaipur and now has sessions across India and even overseas in Oxford, Birmingham, New York, and Oslo. Today we have with us Mr. Manu S. Pillai. Mr. Manu Pillai is author of the award-winning historical book, The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans, the Courtesans, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, Tales from Indian History. Formerly Chief of Staff to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, he has in the past worked at the House of Lords in Britain and with BBC on their Incarnations History series. Written over 6 years and researched in 3 continents, Manu's first book, The Ivory Throne, won the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar. For 3 years, Manu also wrote a weekly column for Mint Lounge. His other writings have appeared in The Hindu, Open Magazine, The Times of India, Hindustan Times, The New Statesman, and other publications. In conversation with him is Miss Shreya Ila Anasuya. Shreya is a writer of speculative fiction and a researcher of music and history. Now I would request the audience to sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. Over to you, Shreya.
Thank you so much, Jyoti. And welcome, Manu. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you about your work, particularly your last book of essays. As you say in the introduction to your last book, we live in times when history is polarizing. You also mentioned that you hope the book gives context to the complexity of South Asian history. To begin with, can you expand on this idea and tell us why this context and complexity is especially important now? And how is a historian's job further complicated by such polarization?
You see, we recently, for example, I was reading something on Twitter, and thank you, by the way, likewise, looking forward to this conversation. This is my second time at the Prabha Khetan Foundation. Years ago, when my first book came out, they'd hosted an event in Calcutta, which was a physical event. Unfortunately, that's no longer possible. Coming back to your question, recently I was reading something about Tipu Sultan. In fact, it was a forward that I got from somebody. Firstly, it had this photograph from the 19th century saying, oh, this is how Tipu actually looked, but this is how we've been taught to think of him. And that was the usual old painting of Tipu Sultan. Now, anybody with half a brain would have known that Tipu Sultan, who died at the end of the 18th century, there was no chance he sat and posed for a camera, which came many decades later. So anybody with half a brain would have realized that, hold on, there's something wrong with this post. But context is important partly for the content of that post, which is about how he was, there were all these atrocities he unleashed in Kerala, in Malabar, when he conquered Malabar, destroyed temples, la la la. All of which is true. It's not that invaders are not very peaceful people. When they're invading a territory, it's always bound to be fairly violent, fairly unpleasant for the people there, and, quite horrific. He was known to be brutal during his war campaigns. Context comes in here in trying to make sense of it, not from our present day view that, oh my God, it was so brutal. A historian's perspective is, let me look at the time itself. Let me look at this man in his context, in his time, and in his role as a king. He didn't live in a democracy. He didn't live in a world where there were human rights. He didn't live in a time where a lot of the values that we now take for granted, and rightly so, didn't exist at that time. That's why that's what we define as progress. Things change with time. For instance, as a king, there were certain things that kings did in general. All kings were violent when they conquered territories. All kings tended to attack anything that was linked to the legitimacy of the rival king. Now, in Tipu's case, this becomes quite interesting because the same Tipu Sultan who's destroying temples in Malabar, he's endowing temples in his settled territories in Mysore. His right-hand man, the finance minister Purnaya, was a Brahmin. More graphically, this is the same Sultan who, on the one hand, he's cutting off the hands of Dwarapalakas in temples in Kerala, while he's sending Shivalingas to the Sringeri Matha to be consecrated in his name and giving specific instructions on what pujas need to be done for him by the Sringeri Matha's Jagat Guru. So he's, on the one hand, courting Hindus in Mysore because that's his settled territory, that's his core territory. He needs their political support, and their support is essential to his legitimacy. Sending those Shivalingas, treating the Jagat Guru of the Sringeri Matha well, treating Lingayat Gurus well, all of this is part of constructing his kingly legitimacy in Mysore. In enemy territory, yes, he will trot out jihadist language. He will say this is a war against the infidels, etc. But there also, it wasn't very black and white. For example, I remember 2 years ago, I was at a literature festival where I met Jaya Jaitley, the politician, and her great grandfather was the Raja of Kolangod. And she told me that in Kolangod, at their ancestral temple, they actually have a pitham on which the deity is consecrated that was donated by Tipu Sultan. Because when Tipu Sultan invaded Malabar, everybody who bent the knee, they were left alone. Those who resisted, well, their temples were attacked. Obviously, for religious people today, it's not easy to swallow these things either way. It's not pleasant to think of temples being destroyed, very old, centuries old shrines and structures being broken down. But the job of a historian is not necessarily to sit here in the present and feel bad about what happened. The job of a historian is to understand what happened, when it happened, why it happened, in the way it happened. And that's where context makes history a lot clearer. It allows us to see people not through a lens of judgment, but a lens of, okay, this was the way it was then, and at least we know what not to do today. At least we know that today we don't want to go around breaking down religious structures and so on. It gives us a certain balance, I would say, as opposed to merely sitting here in our time and our context and sort of viewing everything that happened in the past through that lens, through that filter. A lot of things in the past were not pleasant. It doesn't mean we sit here and judge it now. It just simply means we try and understand why those circumstances emerged in the way they did.
Thank you. Particularly take your point about looking at it from a religious perspective today, feeling offended without understanding exactly how kings and conquerors operated in their own time. I wanted to ask you particularly about your process before we get into some of the essays that are in the book, some of the many, many characters that exist. The essays span a great many contexts and centuries and pack a lot of context and analysis in a relatively short chapter. So can you give us an insight on how you put together this book and, the pleasures of shorter form, shorter non-fiction rather than a very long book like your first that was written over many years? How do you prepare for a set of essays such as this? How much do you research? Where do you stop researching? Because many of us who do research tend to go down the rabbit hole of research and read forever and ever, and we don't really know where to stop. So that would be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, you see, a long book like my first one, The Ivory Throne, that was a 700-page book. I'm still sometimes surprised that it did well for the simple reason that it's such a heavy book. It's surprising always that people picked it up. But that was a book with, like page after page in a single chapter, 21,000 words for a single chapter. That was the kind of, space I had for myself. Another project I've just finished, again, I've got huge chapters in that. And for me, that's perfect because frankly, you can pack in a lot of data, you can pack in a lot of information, you have room to explain something, you have room to develop an argument fully and in all its shades and colors. In a shorter format, that becomes something of a problem. For instance, a lot of the essays in this originally came because I had to do my column in Mint Lounge. And it was sometimes a struggle trying to encapsulate all this in 1,000 words because my real estate on the page never changed. That was fixed. So everything had to be crammed into that, which means I would sometimes do a longer draft and then sort of snip through it to make it fit the word length. But it was an interesting challenge for me because obviously you have to balance nuance, you have to balance the interesting material, you have to write in an interesting way that catches the reader's attention, and you have to also tell it in a style that is appealing or in something of a storytelling format. So trying to combine this is not easy. Obviously, there are some essays I wish I had done differently. There are some that I think, there were sometimes you had to make very conscious compromises where you're like, okay, there's these many elements I want to include. Unfortunately, everything can't go into this format. Therefore, I've got to sort of pick and choose. In terms of the research, some of these essays, for example, come from things I've been researching long term. So a lot of the gender-related essays, some of the women characters, these are things that come up in my regular reading as part of the things I've worked on. So my very first book had the protagonists were two very strong and powerful women. So that's a running stream in my work. Some of the other stuff, such as battles and a rebellion, the Vellore mutiny against the British. I'm not a military historian, so some of that was relatively new. It was relatively, my research did not necessarily go into the great depths of it. I still read some of the parliamentary reports of that time, some of the primary material that existed. Trying to figure out why this rebellion took place. Decades before the 1857 rebellion. All of that was there, but I didn't trouble myself with sort of going in depth for years or months or whatever it is for each of these. In some ways, this is the whole purpose of writing The Courtesan, The Mahatma, and The Italian Brahmin was firstly to entice people to history, because I've seen often at events, etc., there are kids who come and say, oh, we love to talk, we loved all these interesting stories, but we're intimidated by history. Now, I can't fling my 700-page book at them saying, oh, this will teach you to take an interest in history. I thought if I send them, I can offer them something that's lighter essays, essays that give you something of an introduction to offbeat, not stories that you read in your textbooks. They're interesting enough to whet the appetite, but if they're not necessarily detailed academic analyses, then hopefully it will, the next time that kid sees a heavy history book, they won't be hesitant to pick it up. They think, okay, I enjoyed that. Let me give this a shot. It was just my way of trying to construct some kind of interest in history by, offering readers different options. Because I think on the one hand, we complain that, people aren't taking enough of an interest in history, or that history is being twisted, etc. But it's also, I think, the job of those of us who work in history to try and make it more accessible. There's sometimes I think gatekeeping is good in terms of preserving integrity, but sometimes I think it also gets in the way, especially at a time when things are so political and things are so often twisted, like in that WhatsApp forward I mentioned. The only way you can counter that is by making yourself and your work more accessible, which means taking risks sometimes and doing lighter books, which I know, for example, a lot of my academic friends who are doing their PhD with me were very aghast when they saw, oh my God, how can you publish these short essays? But I was like, no, there is a logic to it. And I think it matters. I think it's important to do that.
I certainly think it matters. And I particularly take your point about historians being storytellers. I think of historians as bridges, offering so much more knowledge than we currently are able to have in our very limited sort of present context. And having access to accessible history is not what a lot of us, I didn't grow up with very accessible history books. And it was only later in my life that I understood and began to really take seriously, to the point that I now have a life that centers around a lot of historical research, how important it really is. So I really take your point.
And frankly, it's not, in the West, for example, a lot of historians do what are called popular books.
Exactly.
Mary Beard is a great example. She's an established scholar, but she also writes for the trade presses. She also publishes books for general readers. She makes an effort to make it interesting and fun to read history.
Yeah.
In India, for some reason, that's never really caught on. I mean, now, of course, it has. Lots of young people are trying to do it. But it's odd that we have this orthodoxy that, oh, in India, serious historians must not do it. Whereas, hopefully, in my 2 books out of 3, I think they're heavily footnoted, heavily sort of academically sound. They've got their glowing reviews in peer-reviewed academic journals and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think there is a duty that goes to a larger purpose, as opposed to just catering to your peers and your fellow historians and those who are already interested in history.
Absolutely, especially in a context where historical knowledge that is common knowledge in academic circles for decades is not yet even in the public domain. So I really concur. Coming back to the fact that you talked about options, the many, many, many people that one encounters in the book of essays, I'm going to what I'm going to do is, we don't have enough time to obviously address even half or one fourth of the people that we encounter in the book, but I am going to pick just a few and then ask you questions about those.
Sure.
To begin with, there's the story of the Muslim deity in the Hindu temple in Srirangam in Tamil Nadu. And we come back to the idea of the polarization that we were talking about earlier, and there are examples of, as an antidote to this, we tend to cite examples of religious syncretism, this entire idea of the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, etc. But what we don't talk about enough are the complex ways in which interreligious interactions happened beyond this idea of syncretism, right? So can you tell us more about this story and why you found it interesting?
Yeah, so the broad outline of the story is, a Muslim army from the north is coming in. They've attacked the Srirangam temple. Obviously the priests, and this is actually recorded history. You often find that when Islamic armies invaded, especially South India, there's a greater record for these things in South India because the invasions happened a little later than they happened in North India. You find that priests came up with all kinds of innovative ways to save the deities. Sometimes, you would bury the deity and pray to the deity saying, look, an enemy is here. I have to put you down with Bhumi Devi. I will come and recover you later. Or you put the deity in a pond and say, look, I will come and find you later. In this case, and sometimes they used to construct decoy walls. So in the Sanctum Sanctorum, you construct a fake wall, hide the actual deity behind, and put up a decoy deity in front so that the invader loots the decoy but leaves the actual deity behind. It's fascinating to think of it. Now, the whole trap of thinking that, either it was a war of religions, everything was about religious conflict, or everything was a wonderful syncretic paradise. I think that's a trap, because really it was, as you said, more complex. It wasn't just these two binaries. It was a mix of both. The very fact that the priests are doing this, are trying to save deities, means that they knew that there was something coming that was cataclysmic. That was, iconoclasm was part of the whole process. In Srirangam, and the Srirangam story basically is a way of recording all this in an interesting storytelling style. So what happens in Srirangam is the army comes in. They've taken away one of the idols of the deity from Srirangam and gone all the way back to Delhi. Now the story goes that a lady, Pin Todarnavalli, which actually means she who followed, or she who went behind them. She goes all the way to Delhi behind the army, discovers exactly what's happened to the deity, comes all the way back to Srirangam. This is, miles and miles and hundreds of miles away from each other. She comes back and she tells the priest, look, I know where your deity is. You follow me, I'll take you there. So she goes with all these Brahmins and she takes them to the court of the Sultan in Delhi, where they are performers and they're musicians and they sort of entertain him and please him. And he basically says, wonderful, I'm very happy with all of you. I'll grant you a boon, like I'll give you a gift, tell me what you want. And they say, we just want one thing, we want our deity back. And the Sultan says, oh, okay, yeah, I've got all these deities I've looted from around India. They're sitting in a storeroom. Very unlikely. Deities do not, sit in storerooms in the palaces of sultans. But anyway, he says there's a storeroom here. So they go to look for their deity among all the other deities that are kept there, only to discover that he's missing. What's happened is the Sultan's daughter has picked up the deity, the idol, and she's playing with it like she would with a doll. Now, which means she bathes it, feeds it, all of that. Now, in temple ritual in India, in temple customs in India, this is exactly what we do to our deities. We wake them in the morning, we take them on processional baths. They often have marriages. In Kerala, there are goddesses who menstruate, then there's a ritual purifying bath. All of these things happen. They are treated as kings, or they are treated as human beings. So essentially, by doing this, the Muslim princess is doing puja to the deity. And the deity, therefore, is sort of, very pleased with her because she's showing bhakti to the deity. And in fact, there's this in the temple chronicles, there's this amusing line which says that the god, she played with it as a doll during the day, and in night, the god took human form to play with her. You can read whatever you want into it, but I like to think that our ancestors had a sense of humor when recording these stories. Either way, the princess, when she's asleep or something, the priests pick up the deity and they're on their way back to Srirangam. At that time, she wakes up and she discovers her beloved is gone. So she starts following them. One set of priests hide away the deity. They go off somewhere else and hide the deity. So when she actually gets to Srirangam, the deity isn't there. And she, in the pangs of separation, sort of collapses there and dies. Eventually, when the deity is brought back, the deity says, no, this Muslim princess was a consort. I've accepted her as one of my wives, and she must also be enshrined in the temple. And thus, just as the deity is brought back into the temple, it's not just Srirangam. The same story exists in the Melkote temple as well. In one place, you have an actual small figurine of a veiled woman who's the Muslim, the Tuluka Nachyar. Tuluka could be either Turuska, which is a word that was used for Muslims, or it could even be Tughlaq, because that's when the Tughlaq dynasty was in power in Delhi. So they actually have a figurine representing this Muslim consort of the deity. In the other temple, it's basically a wall painting. And every time the deity is brought out on certain processions to meet this particular consort, he's dressed in a colorful lungi, because in South India, Muslims were originally coastal communities. So you associate the colorful lungi with Muslims. And she's fed, the Bhagwan is given North Indian food, like chapatis, etc., as prasad over there. Like that's what is offered to him and then given out as prasad. It's a way, it's both syncretism, but it's also representing a more painful encounter. It's a song, it's a story that tries to communicate that this whole thing was painful. We do recognize that there's something different between a Hindu worldview and a Muslim worldview. And yet the story is also trying to say that, there is a way to get beyond it. There is a way to sort of make the two meet. It's also possible that this is a response to something else. You often find these songs of resistance, which is about Islamic kings lusting after these Hindu princesses, the most famous being the Padmavati story in Chittor. This is a sort of reversal of that. Here you have a Muslim princess who's deeply devoted and in love in a physical as well as spiritual sense with a Hindu deity, and she is so much in love that she collapses and dies of shock the moment she is separated from the deity. So it's also, in a way, a role reversal. It's also a way of perhaps sort of countering those other narratives in which the Hindu women are the helpless ones and the Muslim kings are the warriors or the virile figures. And so there are multiple things happening here in the story. It's all at once trying to build a bridge. It's also trying to communicate separateness. It's also trying to sort of play this own poetic sort of game with other songs of resistance that were there. So it's just fascinating. And the fact that this was accepted and enshrined in a temple, this is just one example. The famous Sabrimala temple has, before you enter Sabrimala, you go to Vavar Swami's shrine. And Vavar is basically the Muslim comrade of Sabrimala Ayyappa. And Babar sounds very close to Babar. For all you know, it's just a Malayalicized version of Babar. There's all kinds of other texts which have similar stories, where a sultan's daughter, for example, discovers that in all her previous lives she was married to the same Hindu prince in all of his previous lives, and they're both incarnations of Hindu gods and things like that. So all of these are basically trying to do multiple things. We just need to be able to recognize all those multiple things instead of falling into this black and white of either conflict or either everybody was just very happy and they didn't even know what religion was. It's a mix of all of these things that are happening. Just as our world is complex, the past was also complex.
Exactly. And even religious views, even within the, one single religion, very different.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I wanted to actually talk a little bit more along these lines, but with Shivaji. And you've written extensively about Shivaji, of course, also in your second book, and in other columns. I was reading some of them, and I like, the thing that I wanted to ask you about was how you've emphasized that you cannot appropriate his political life or his political ideas into a simplistic us versus them battle between Hindus and Muslims. And so I wanted to ask you, I mean, as a sort of cheeky counter to the weird the WhatsApp forward that you received, what's the difference between how Shivaji is seen and what's projected onto him today versus how he must have operated within his own time and context?
Yeah. It's a similar thing, actually, because I'll give you, from his own life, if you take examples. Once he consecrated himself as the king of the Marathas in 1674, he commissioned a Brahmin to do a Sanskrit poem. It's generally called the Shiva Bharata. And in this poem, you find that Shivaji is a Vishnu reborn to sort of destroy the Mlechas. And it's very clear the Mlechas refers to the Muslims, to the Muslim power in the Indian subcontinent. Not individual Muslims, but the idea of Islamic power. He's basically talking about how, he's a divine incarnation who's here with a purpose. Now, if you read just that in isolation, you'll think, see, Shivaji is saying Muslims are bad, we must fight the Muslims. And that's often what most people think. But if you read this text a little more carefully, you will find that certain Muslims are described as dharmatmas, acceptable people, noble, wise, and legitimate rulers. Certain others are distinguished as wicked, as, Kali incarnated on earth and things like that. So he's making a distinction between that. He's not fully delegitimizing Islamic rule. A character like Malik Ambar, he describes him as Kartikeya. He compares him to Kartikeya. As Kartikeya fought the Asuras surrounded by the other gods, so Malik Ambar fought the Mughals surrounded by other Maratha warriors. So he's making comparisons of that nature. Now, yes, he was definitely building on a religious vocabulary and using it for political purposes. He did talk of a Hindavi Swaraj. He did basically say Islamic power in India is now corrupt and we need to think of a new way. You do see some of that in the Shiva Bharata, but remember, there he's a freshly consecrated king. Shivaji did not come from a royal family. He was the first Maratha Chhatrapati, which meant he was falling back on older classical ideas of Hindu kingship, building on that to sort of construct his own kingship. And kingship was often constructed in a religious vocabulary. In practice, the king may not necessarily organize his politics on religious grounds. Shivaji employed Qazis, he employed Muslims, he had no issues sacking even Surat, where most of the people who were looted were Hindu Banyas. They were not Muslims or people from another religion. So it's not black and white there. As a king, however, he's defining his ideology, he's defining his worldview, his kingly identity. But so are we saying that there was no syncretic element at all? Not really. Shivaji's father's name was Shahaji. His uncle's name was Shah Sharif. Sharif Ji. And both these names were given to these boys because their parents did not have children for a long time. So they went to a Sufi called Shah Sharif. He blessed them and they named the sons born to them after a Muslim man. So Shivaji's own father and uncle are named after a Muslim man. In Rajputana, you go to a place and you must have heard the surname Shekhawat. That comes from a line where they say there was a Sheikh Burhan, if I'm not wrong, who blessed a certain Rajput prince, and all his descendants thereafter, who were born of that blessing, they've been called Shekhawats ever since. Rajputs are seen as staunch Hindus, but here you have an entire clan of Rajputs who are named essentially after a Sufi saint. So, as a person from that social context, Shivaji's on-the-ground society was very syncretic. His grandparents had no issues going to a Sufi saint and naming their kids after a Sufi. But when he transitions into kingship, kingship is a different thing. There you have to emphasize your power and your ideology in a new language. That is where the religion comes in. That is where that religious vocabulary comes in. And you sort of build on that. So both are true of the same man. Just as I said, Tipu Sultan was destroying temples in one place, but also donating to temples in another place. Here you have something similar. You have a syncretic, the same family, the same kingly person doing something syncretic on the ground in his everyday lived experience, but as a king taking a completely different avatar, because that's what kings did. And it wasn't just Shivaji. You take somebody like the Mughal Emperor Babur. When he first came to India, you don't see in his own autobiography, you don't really see any jihadist language. He was very flexible with religion. At one time, he needed help from the Persians. He pretended to have converted to the Shia faith, got the help, and then reverted to Sunnism. So he could be very convenient about his religious loyalties, depending on the moment and depending on various contingencies. In India, he trots out jihadist language on one occasion, which is in that famous battle with the Rajputs, where his troops are demoralized. His favorite generals hate the climate in India. They've all gone back to Afghanistan. His people have been defeated in multiple smaller battles, and he's now preparing for the final showdown. That's where he falls back on religion, smashes the wine jars and all of that, and calls this a jihad and a religious war, galvanizes his troops, and ends up winning. But you see the moment in which he chooses religion is a moment of crisis. The moments where he's got confidence, he doesn't necessarily need that kind of religious vocabulary. So just as our politicians today mine religion for political needs and purposes, the same political party can speak in forked tongues in different places. In one place you can't eat beef, in another place they're like, no, we're fine with beef. Partly because of, you're responding to different issues in different places. But just as today's politicians mine religion for political purposes, people in the past also did. And I think we should allow them that. I don't think people in the past existed in some kind of different planet or so on. They were susceptible to the same tendencies as us. We shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that politics governed or religion governed politics completely. Religion was one of several strands in politics. It was not the overwhelming factor in politics. I'm not denying the importance of religion, but I'm saying we should not overstate the importance of religion either. They also had a convenient attitude to religion when they wanted.
Absolutely. And I think in one of the essays, you make a distinction between narrative rhetoric versus real politics, what people had to do versus what they were saying they were doing. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. I want to ask you about one of my personal favorite stories, and the ways in which it shifted. Right, I'm referring to Shakuntala, because so much myth and legend is melded into history in different ways. Some ways not, in some ways it's not desirable, and in some ways it's really fascinating. And you're talking about the fierce and self-possessed Shakuntala in the Mahabharata versus the very naive, sort of docile, star-crossed woman in Kalidas's Shakuntala. Can you tell us why exactly Kalidas's Shakuntala found so much favor within 18th and 19th century Western imagination? And also, as a follow-up to that, how did that set the stage for how Indians themselves portrayed women in mythology?
So, this is why we read, again, texts are also read in context. When you read a text, you don't just read it at face value saying, oh, this is what the text says, so it must be true. You also analyze the text itself and interrogate the text itself. In what context is it happening? Who's written it? In what language have they written it? What period have they written it? These questions give us answers to a wider sort of set of issues rather than just the text itself. We don't myopically focus just on the text. Shakuntala is a good example because in the typical story that we have, King Dushyanta is on his big hunting trip. He lands in the ashram and he sees this beautiful girl, and she's extremely shy, extremely coy. She doesn't talk directly to him. It's her maids who do all the talking for her. Of course, he then wants to get along with her and get her to marry him. So they have this Gandharva Vivaha, all very sweet. And then he gives her a ring and he promises that this was like a token of his affection, and eventually he'd come back for her, etc. Naturally, then there's a saint who comes in, a sage who visits. Shakuntala is very distracted. Her head is in the clouds because she's dreaming of her lover. The sage curses her for not taking care of him properly, saying your lover will forget you. And eventually, when she's, and of course, when her maid servants all come running and they say, "Oh, poor thing, she didn't mean it." So the curse says, "Okay, fine. When the king sees the ring, he will remember you." Naturally, on the way to the king, the ring is lost. So when she lands up in the king's court, the king doesn't recognize her. She weeps. Her Apsara mother comes, saves her. They go away. And years later, or at some point, the ring lands up in a fish. The king sees it eventually through the royal kitchens. And the king sort of realizes what's happened and goes after Shakuntala. Everybody's absolved. So there's neither of the human characters are at fault here. It's entirely the curse and supernatural elements that have conspired against them. This is not the original Shakuntala story in the Mahabharata, because in the Mahabharata, what you see is King Dushyanta comes, Shakuntala meets him. There are no maids, there are no intermediaries. She's not shy to talk to him. On the contrary, when this king says that he wants to do this Gandharva Vivaha thing, she says first she's not interested as such, but eventually she says, fine, but my son born from this must be the king, must be the next king. So she extracts a promise from the king. She's a woman with a mind of her own to begin with. This happens. There's no ring, there is no curse, there's no sage, none of that happens. She has a peculiar 36-month pregnancy, at the end of which she has a baby boy. And with the boy, she goes to the court. When she goes to the court, the king deliberately lies. He is at fault there because he thinks, oh, this woman's walked in. I had a tryst with her years ago. Now, if she's walked in with this child, what will people think? After 36 months, she's come. And what will people think of me if a stray woman walks in and claims she's got my son? So he lies and he says, birds, there are some birds that have a habit of laying their eggs in the nests of other birds. How do I know this is even my child, etc.? Insults her. She doesn't cry. She doesn't wait for her Apsara mother to come and rescue her. She basically looks him in the eye and says, even without you, my son will rule. You rule the earth, I fly the skies. She's a woman of confidence in that story. Now, it's interesting that the Kalidas version came, of course, many, many centuries later. To begin with, the Kalidas version is a reflection of changing social mores. Things that are changing in society. People have a new sense of how women should behave. People have a new idea of what feminine conduct is. All of that gets reflected in Kalidas's work. It's not as though Kalidas in many ways reshaped all of that, but he perhaps captured a changing mood in society. And it's not just him. Even the story of Ahilya, in the original story, when Indra comes in disguise, she sees through the disguise. She knows this is not her husband, but she has a certain curiosity. She's allowed that sense of desire. She's a human being. She's given that. In the later versions, Ahilya is not aware. Indra basically tricks her, and Ahilya is then absolved of all guilt and absolved of desire as well, which is a very human and real quality. Human beings have desire. So it's not just Shakuntala who's changed as a character. In terms of why Shakuntala and the Kalidas version became popular, obviously it was a wonderfully popular and a very famous poem. It landed in the hands of the British Orientalists at the end of the 18th century. So William Jones famously in Calcutta in the 1780s and 90s. And he translated the Kalidas's Abhinjana Shakuntalam into English. Of course, censored it because he didn't want any of the sensuous and more sexual elements to be conveyed in the English language, because his audience in the West would be aghast if they read that. So he, firstly, to begin with, he desensualized the text. He then translated it, and in some ways, that Victorianized, highly sanitized Shakuntala, who received attention and publicity in the West, seems to have come back to India and sort of penetrated our textbooks, our consciousness as well. And we have since then taken that Shakuntala, this very innocent, very pavam girl who doesn't know what she's doing, who can't even speak directly because she's so shy. We've internalized that Shakuntala, and most of us have forgotten the original, the source of the story, the original Mahabharat Shakuntala, who was nothing like this, who was a far more confident and even bold woman, which again is a reflection of our society. It's a reflection of what we as a people expect of women, that we have enshrined and celebrated this Shakuntala over that Shakuntala. So it's actually a fascinating mix-up of colonial morality, Victorian influences, the politics of translation. All of this comes together, and our own social and cultural insecurities. They all come together to decide exactly how we choose to look at our historical figures and epic figures, and also which of them we elevate and which we don't. Which side of the same character we highlight and which side we ignore. That's also a trend we see. I'll quickly stop with the example I always give of Bhakti saints. We always talk of Mirabai as a Krishna Bhakta, and we always even in the stamp that commemorates her, she's holding a veena, and she's seen as this devout lady who's singing bhajans. But we forget that this was a woman who, when her husband died, her Rajput family wanted her to commit sati, and she said, "I will not become a sati." This was a family that said, "You must behave like a widow. You can't meet strangers, and especially these wandering saints and men." And she said, "No, I will meet exactly who I want." And she talks about how people try to kill her, etc., her own relatives. And finally, she walks out of that palace. She walks out of what is a patriarchal setup, denies and defies that institution, and becomes a wandering saint. So behind the bhajans, there is also dissent. There is also somebody who stood up in her time and questioned the social system that existed. We teach our children the bhajans, we teach our children about the devotional element, and we forget that Mirabai asked questions, because we don't like people asking inconvenient questions. But all of Indian history is about people asking inconvenient questions. We just haven't been trained to look at them.
I'm glad you brought up Bhakti poets, because I'm aware we don't have a lot more time. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I will let the audience also ask their questions. But I wanted to ask you about Chokha Mela, the Dalit Bhakti poet who was canonized, versus Karma Mela. And you talk about how Karma Mela didn't get canonized in the same way. How can this particular history inform the way we read the canon of Bhakti poetry itself, given that the poets were all, after all, situated in a vastly caste hierarchical society? When we think about the Bhakti poets, we don't necessarily, we say, oh yeah, they are, they were social rebels and they asked these questions, but then who could ask what question is something that you probe in that particular story. So my final question is around that.
Yeah, Chokha Mela, as you said, was a Dalit Bhakti poet. He eventually dies when he's doing manual work, and they say that even his bones were chanting God's name. And he was such a great bhakta that outside the temple in Pandharpur, they decided to commemorate him, give him a shrine of his own. But of course, because he was a Dalit, there was no question of allowing him to enter the temple. So even now, his shrine, or the little thing that commemorates him, is at the gate of the temple, not inside the temple. It's an interesting illustration of the complexities even in Bhakti. Bhakti was supposed to be this great liberating force. People often think Bhakti was anti-caste, but I would argue Bhakti was about equal access to God, equal access to spiritual, subjects and so on, without the mediation of priests. It wasn't about denying castes. It was about each caste to its own, but everybody has a right to God. That was the sort of attitude you see in Bhakti. Very few Bhakti figures actually question caste itself. What they question is access. What they question is, why do some castes have certain privileges above other castes in terms of God? But outside of God, in the secular realm, very few of them actually question secular elements of caste, the discrimination in the non-spiritual context. It could easily be that, spirituality was a vehicle. When you talk of God, when you couch your dissent with lots of mentions of God, perhaps it was safer to stand up to caste. It could easily also be that. Now, you mentioned Chokamela and Karmamela. Karmamela was a son who was much more forthright, who was not very pleased. Chokamela, in some ways, the father, in some ways, he accepted his lot in life. He accepted his fate in life. He said, I was born in a caste. All he says is, whether the sugar cane is ugly or not, when you squeeze it, you get the same sugar. So treat me like that. I'm an ugly person, and this is from one of his poems. I'm not somebody you like, but at least give me this, the right to venerate God. At least give me that access. Karma Mela is not like that. Karma Mela is like, this is hypocrisy. And therefore, you find that his songs are not really sung much in that whole Pandharpur tradition. But, more than them, I'll give you the example of two women. There was a Bhakti saint called Janabai, a late medieval period. She was a kitchen maid in the house of a male Bhakti saint. And in one of her poems, which was one of my favorites, is it begins with, God, do me a favor and kill my mother-in-law. God, while you're at it, kill my father-in-law. She adds a sister-in-law to the list. Basically, she wants God to eliminate all these other people. It's funny, and it's funny to think that 800 years ago we had such, amusing poetry being written. But it's also very powerful because she's saying that I'm a woman. I'm stuck in this world of domestic drudgery, serving people all day long. My world is the kitchen. Whereas the male Bhakti saint in whose house she works, he has the freedom to go out and talk esoteric concepts with men and so on. She's stuck in the kitchen. So her bhakti takes that kitchen form. God comes and helps her wash dishes. God comes and takes lice out of her hair. God helps her clean the food. That's the kind of relationship she has with God. She can chastise God when God doesn't behave well in the kitchen or he cooks something that's bad. That's the kind of relationship she has. But she stands up to it. At one point, she says, I wish I was a bazaar woman. Basically, she's referring to prostitutes, because at least I would be free then to go out and be with you in that sense. On the other hand, a few centuries later, in the 17th century, we have a similar Bhakti saint in Maharashtra called Bahinabai. Now, Bahinabai is born in the Brahmin caste. She also says similar things. She talks about how her husband is cruel to her, violent. He doesn't like the fact that she's getting a lot of attention. People are coming to her and recognizing her as a saint. She also faces the problem of being in a patriarchal society. But she eventually says, at the end of it, husband and wife, it's like fish and water. We have to live with it. Therefore, I will accept my lot. It's interesting that in her position, this upper caste woman chose to make her peace with the status quo, whereas the lower caste woman who's working as a kitchen maid, she says, no, I'm stuck as a kitchen maid, but I don't like it. I don't make my peace with it. Kill all these people so that I can be free. So it's interesting that, as you said, who comes from what background determines a lot of things. Chokamela came from what we would now call a Dalit background. Perhaps he did not have the freedom to be very direct and blunt in his language, even in his poetry. Other saints, even if they came not from Brahmin caste, Tukaram, etc., some of them were tailors, some of them ran shops. That was the kind of background they came from. But they were still high up enough in the caste hierarchy to be able to afford to be a little more pointed. Even somebody like Kabir, there's a story, right, that he was thrown into a river and left to drown, that he was punished for his position. He was a weaver. So your exact class position and your exact location in the social hierarchy also determines how much you can say and how you can say it and how you can frame it. Your gender determines a lot of these things as well. Gender determines access. These female Bhakti saints, they do not have access to a lot of the men who were in that same fold. So they often imagine them. These men are often in poetry. Tukaram comes to one of these female Bhakti saints in a dream and sort of blesses her. I think Bahinabai, comes to her in a dream because she cannot have direct access. So it's interesting that all of these, if you read them at face value, oh, Tukaram came to her in a dream and inspired her, clap. But no, read between the lines and you realize she's making a larger point, which is that I'm a woman, I'm stuck here, and therefore this is my only way of engaging on it as an intellectual equal with a male Bhakti figure.
Thank you. Thank you especially for bringing up Janabai, who is one of my personal favorite poets of all time. Startling verse, gorgeous, and revolutionary. And just to end with the thought of, what Chokha Mela made possible also in his wake for Karma Mela to stand up and address the question more directly. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. And I'm going to hand it back over to Jyoti to take questions from the audience.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Shreya. What a wonderful conversation. What a deep insights towards the history and the poetic side of our culture and our country. It was really wonderful and never wanted to end this session, but we have a few more questions from the audience side.
Sure.
So I will take those questions up. We have a question coming in from Pinaz Raut. And the question is, most of the school history books, at least the NCERT books commissioned by the government, usually have a Delhi or North-centric perspective on history. So she's asking, Manu, do you think that the history books need revamping in the syllabus to cover more geographic expanse of stories as much as possible?
I think that's true. In fact, this is one of my complaints as well, which is that I remember in high school, for example, primary school history books are not very serious. Nobody's even paying attention. But a lot of high school history books, yeah, they do have an ultra north focus. Not all of it is because somebody's conspired for it to be that way. A lot of it depends on the simple fact of access to material. For example, the Mughal Empire lasted till 1857. It was the last big empire in India. So the available data is much richer. As a result, and then the Mughals finally did spread out over a large part of India. And so the data is very rich. The Marathas also get a certain amount of attention, not adequate attention, but a fair amount of attention because there's data. But an empire like the Vijayanagara Empire, for example, it collapsed and faded out by the 17th century, by the middle of the 17th century. So you don't have enough material. So, often I think when these writers of textbooks take the easy way out and just, choose things that are already there, they're already set, and you don't have to do too much work. But you're right. I think India is such a complicated country. There are so many stories. There are so many cultures within the the overarching civilizational space that I think we have to sort of spread out and sort of explore a lot more of these regions. Kerala with its matrilineal system and a system where even Maharanis were actually called Maharajas when they ruled. There was no gender difference there. If you ruled, you were called a Maharaja, irrespective of whether you were a man or a woman. That Kerala with its matrilineal system is not the same as, say, the history of Bengal and characters in Bengal, where you have, for instance, a Hindu man getting his son converted to Islam and then making him a sultan. You've got a case like that in Bengal. We don't talk about the role of Africans in Indian history. In the Deccan, Africans were a huge force. They were mercenaries who came in. They were brought in as military slaves. And somebody like Malik Ambar for 25 years, a generation and a half before Shivaji, he was the one who stood between the Mughals and the conquest of the south. This one African warlord who had banded the Marathas together with him and banded the Africans. We don't talk enough about women in Indian history. It's not just geography. Marginalization happens on various grounds. It's not that we lack women characters. It's just that we haven't been taught to look at them and give them equal emphasis and importance in the way we approach Indian history. So yeah, there is a lot of room for correction in the way history is taught in the country. I'm still not very hopeful about high school textbooks because these are 100-page textbooks. There's a limit to how much you can cram in. What I would focus on really is university level stuff. And I would encourage that even students who are in engineering or the science field, they at least have one humanities subject, some things that are related to the social sciences, so that your mind is fully developed. And at that critical age of 17, 18, you're not cut off completely from subjects like history. I think that's the way to rectify this.
Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful insight on this question. Definitely, I feel, something can be done on the textbooks to make these more interesting and kids more inquisitive about, what happened in the history and take that up in the universities level as well. So we have another question coming up for you. And it's Pinaz is again asking, Manu, I have heard that one of your books, presumably The Ivory Throne, is being adapted by the Arca Media Works Group. If that's true, then can you share any insights on the same?
Oh, it's been optioned for a web series. Fingers crossed that it happens. These things take a long time. It's they're still working on it. So yeah, hopefully. I wish it happened overnight, and in a year there'd be a web series and so on. But yeah, the way these things work, I've just discussing with somebody I know. The screenplay writing, you have to create a mood board, something called a show Bible. Then it has to be greenlit by a platform. It's a huge process. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it being made.
Wishing you best for that.
Thank you.
So another question coming up is, your first book, The Ivory Throne, is quite text and information heavy, but the same detailing makes it very interesting to read because it helps in the world building in the reader's mind. Is the next project that you're working on the similar lines or more of a novel of sorts?
No, so the thing is, after I wrote The Ivory Throne, because it was a 704-page book, I had promised myself I would never write anything more than, say, 350, maximum 400 pages. Again, I haven't been able to keep that promise. The next two books were shorter. I think Rebel Sultans was 300 something. Courtesan is a collection of essays, so the number of pages isn't that much of an issue. With the next one, unfortunately, it's a 550-page book, but hopefully it's fun. There is a degree of world building there. It's I wouldn't reveal too much about it because it only comes out next month. But yeah, it is more or less, it's closer to Ivory Throne than to the other two books that I've done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the answers. Hopefully, these answers are quite satisfactory for Pinaz because you have asked these questions. And it was really wonderful listening to you. Now I will hand over to our SAS women from Mumbai, Avni Thakur, for the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of our foundation, I, Anvi Thakkar, SAS Women of Mumbai, would like to thank Mr. Manu Pillai and Ms. Shreya Ila Anaisu for today's interesting and stimulating conversation. I would also like to thank our presenter, Shri Cement Limited. We also are very grateful to our media partner, Lokmat, and our hospitality partner, ITC Grand Central Mumbai, Radisson Blue Nagpur, O Hotel Pune for their association with us. Last but not the least, I would like to thank our patrons who made this session possible even during difficult times. Stay well, stay safe, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Shreya.
Thank you,
Thanks,
guys.
Shreya. Thank you, Mr. Pillai.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.